Here we go.
Where's the PSG super?
So we explained, at least yesterday, where we kind of focused on domestic policy, is that Napoleon had been fighting against these different coalitions, that when he started the business with trying to defeat Britain by messing with Egypt, he had actually, lost to Britain, and that's going to be kind of a defining narrative in the stuff that we're going to do today, left some of his troops stranded. And that because they had gotten bogged down in Egypt, and because Britain had showed at least, had cracked, I don't know, maybe some of their aura of invincibility a little bit, that there was a continuation of that war that went on between 1788, 1789, early 1800, et cetera, et cetera. Napoleon had to take care of the initial business, which was the coup d'etat that is actually going to create the new constitution and put him in charge as first consul. All right. But then he's got to get about the business of finishing that war, which is cool. You could almost say that he might have let some of that escape a little bit for political effect, because now he can go and do what he's great at, which is fighting war. And was able to defeat the Austrians again, sign another peace treaty in 1801, and then he was able to cut a peace agreement with the British. So now he's completely out of it, all right? And that time that we spent at the end of yesterday, where we were looking at the Napoleonic Code, we were looking at, the Lycée and l'École Polytechnique and all of the education stuff that he's revamping, the Bank of France, the public works, all of these things that he has that are really targeted at every different social class in France. The nobles get something. It's not everything that they want, but they get something. The middle class, of course, is thrilled, at least with a good component or a good part of the Civil Code of 1804, which has reinforced the things that they care about. The idea of meritocracy, the idea of equality of opportunity, the idea that the liberties that they were given during at least the bourgeois phase of the revolution are now insured. Okay? The private property protection, which is something that they were a little bit nervous about, that gain is solidified. All right. If you were to receive an essay that said, let's look at Napoleon's domestic policies, and can you evaluate the strengths and weaknesses, or the positives and negatives of that domestic policy, you should be able to find a lot of pretty good positives. Did we talk about some of the negatives? Like, who would you include in the negatives? Women, for sure. Okay. Another group, maybe? Not so much the peasants. The peasants came out okay.
The aristocracy.
The working class. The aristocracy, a lot of their misery came way before Napoleon. All right, Napoleon was at least trying to make nice with them and say, come back, you can earn a living, you can serve as officers, we could certainly use you in the military, but you're not getting your titles back. Those days are over. You're not getting your estates back. Those days are over as well. All right. But you certainly still have enough wealth that you could, you can survive and thrive here in France if you're willing to put in a day's work. All right. But working class people, you could definitely say, look, we were on the cusp of something. We saw with the sans-culotte, and we saw with, Gracchus Babeuf and some of those things, that there was at least an understanding of the potential for collectivity, that the working class was starting to identify themselves as such and had the potential for organization. But Napoleon kind of nipped that in the bud too, and said the idea of you being able to unionize or to strike, those things are outlawed by the Civil Code. All right. Anyway, long story short, domestic policy, he spends his time, he spends it wisely, he made nice with the church. What was that event called? Called the Concorde out of what year was it?
1789.
That's right, 1801. It was a Concorde out of 1801, but it was an agreement with the Pope where Napoleon and the Pope sit down. But it was a kind of an exhale, if you will, for a lot of the peasants, a lot of the people that identified themselves as Catholic, that Catholicism is back now. It's not serving as like some type of underground rebellion like it was during the Directory phase, and it wasn't something that would have gotten you executed like it was during the Reign of Terror. Really, since the days of the Civil Code or Civil Constitution of the Clergy, the 1790, there's been a concerted attack against Roman Catholicism. And this is Napoleon saying that's not a really good use of our time. All right? This is a traditionally Catholic country. We've had a long-standing relationship with the church. I'm not really standing in the way of that. All I want is the respect to know that I am the leader, that the Pope is not the leader, and that we control education and we control those things. All right, and that was the agreement that he was able to get. Okay, now, Napoleon's got the people. He's also coronated in 1804. That period called the Consulate, it ends in 1804. The next 10 years is referred to as Empire. He's declared emperor. That begins in 1804, and really for the remainder of his stay, he's referred to as Emperor Napoleon. And that's the part that I said gets a little bit hypocritical, because he's sort of taking on the persona of a monarch, an absolute monarch. Okay, he's kind of turning his back a little bit on his roots. He kind of forgets where he came from a little bit. All right, moves out of the neighborhood, if you will. All right. But once he's emperor, now he gets to the business of trying to build that empire and do the things that he's good at, which is try to take over the world. Okay. It begins in the same fashion that it kind of ends, that here's the deal. He is preoccupied with defeating Great Britain. All right, that's the one kind of like gnat. That's the one mosquito that he just can't seem to be able to kill. All right, he has an easy time, it seems, with being able to carry out campaigns against the East. So if he's fighting Austria or Prussia, or eventually he's going to fight Russia, he has some success at that. We'll get to Russia in just a second. All right, but at least from the early going, it starts out with hang an L, because he tried to take on Britain. Take out the fact that he got an L hung on him by successes carried out against the East. Wars against Austria, wars against Prussia, eventually kind of like a campaign against some of the Russian troops, and all ends up going well. Okay? Here's the map, if you guys can see it in the background here. Okay? So, it starts out in 1804, 1805, actually late 1805. There is a battle where it seems pretty clear that Napoleon is preparing for some kind of invasion against Great Britain proper. All right? And it's foiled. And it's foiled off of the Atlantic coast at a battle called the Battle of Trafalgar. Okay? Who was the person that handed him the big L in Egypt, or north of Egypt? Nelson. Admiral Horatio Nelson. It was called the Battle of the Nile. All right, and that's what ultimately stranded his troops and handed him his big loss. Now again, Horatio Nelson is going for victory number 2. So he's 0-2 against Horatio Nelson. In your notes, I referred to Horatio Nelson as Gustavus Adolphus. All right. That's a really high-level AP kind of question because A, it involves knowledge of Horatio Nelson. B, it involves knowledge of Gustavus Adolphus. C, it involves an understanding of how they would be similar. You guys remember who Gustavus Adolphus was? He was the king of Sweden during what major war that was fought for 30 years between 1618 and 1648? Might be the 30 Years' War. Yeah, that's right. But he was a Protestant that was fighting against the centralizing efforts of the Habsburg, the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand, who seems like he's centralizing and Catholicizing the German states. As a Swede and as a Protestant, he was concerned about those efforts and eventually engaged the Catholic Habsburg forces and then turned the tides. That turning point battle was called Lutzen. Okay? And unfortunately, Gustavus Adolphus died in that battle. Okay? Napoleon, if he takes out Britain, there really isn't a whole lot that remains in continental Europe that he's not going to have control of. because he's having a pretty easy time in his efforts to defeat the Prussians and the Austrians. All right? But he's unable to beat the British. This really is one of the great turning points. The Battle of Trafalgar is a major battle. Horatio Nelson is felled in that battle. All right, so he's kind of the guy that provides the one thing that is able to defeat the top dog. And that's why there's a Trafalgar Square, and that's why there's statues of Nelson everywhere in Britain. All right, back to the notes then, and if you look at the story, between 1805, 6, and 7, major campaigns carried out against the Austrians and then the Prussians. You can read about the battles of Austerlitz, the Battle of Ulm, the Battle of Auerstadt, the Battle of Jena. These are all major battles that are fought against the Austrian and the Prussians, and they're all big victories for Napoleon. And eventually the Russians end up getting involved in the campaign, and he's able to defeat the Russians and occupy the territory here, which makes up modern-day Poland. Okay, and look at what's going on here. He's dissolved the Holy Roman Empire and has created his own puppet kingdom there called the Confederation of the Rhine, meaning that the geography that ultimately becomes Germany, Napoleon has effectively created that geography under this 38 German state coalition called the Confederation of the Rhine. The Austrian Empire still exists to some degree. There's a very modified version of Prussia. And then there is a Grand Duchy of, or Duchy of Warsaw, that is basically Poland, that is under his control. And then you've got a peace treaty with Russia. All right, Napoleon is able to sign a peace treaty. It's called the Treaty of Tilsit. It's pretty famous. There's a river, I think it's called the Niemen River, that meets like right outside the battle where they had defeated the Russians, called Friedland. And Alexander the Great, Alexander the First, the Tsar of Russia at the time, and Napoleon meet out on this raft in the middle of the river. And then they basically sign this agreement. And this agreement is that these boundaries, you're either with an ally or a satellite of the French Empire. Okay? And Russia is at peace with the French Empire. All right? And I mean, if he stops there, it's done. I told you about Walter White yesterday. Okay? Could he just be satisfied with being the meth kingpin of the southwestern United States? No. And Napoleon couldn't be satisfied unless he took these guys out. And so the plan that he comes up with is called the Continental System. He's like, I can't invade them. Trafalgar pretty much ended that dream for me. But what I could do is I can starve them. And he's already tried to do that, at least to a limited extent, in Egypt. But now he's basically saying, I am putting an embargo on British goods. We are going to effectively put a curtain around continental Europe, and nobody that is part of my kingdom or part of my satellites or part of my allies is going to be able to do any business with Britain. None of their goods come in, none of our goods go out to Britain in particular. We are shutting those trade spigots off. Okay? And the idea was Britain is such an economic commercial powerhouse that denying them continental Europe as a potential trade partner is going to weaken them significantly. What Napoleon didn't count on was the fact that Britain has the Americas, has India and all of its other colonies that it can trade with, and it will just amp up its markets over there. But also, Europe needed British goods a hell of a lot more than Britain needed Europeans' goods. And that there was so unlucrative for them to be able to abide by the Continental System that British goods were getting smuggled into Europe like nobody's business. And that even some of the culprits were members of Napoleon's own family that were circumventing the Continental System in order to get a hold of British goods. Napoleon assumed, and correctly, that the majority of the British goods were coming in through ports in Portugal. So what's his next move? To go after the Iberian Peninsula and control it directly. And then I can cut off that as an access point. So in 1807, thus begins what they call the Peninsular Campaign. And I refer to this as Napoleon's Vietnam. Okay? One of the things that Napoleon gave that was both a blessing and a curse to the countries that he had an impact on was nationalism. And nationalism is like religion. It bears a lot of the same attributes because it's based on elemental feelings and sentiments. Okay? You're a nationalist by heart, not necessarily by head. All right? And it has a religious aspect of it because it intensifies the belief that you are psychically united with a whole community of people. That there's something that is bigger than just you that's out there. And that means that's something that is worth fighting for. The French, with liberty, fraternity, equality, the French were able to defeat all comers during that stage of the revolution because they had a sense of that. That we, the people, the French people, are willing to make great sacrifices because we are trying to protect France from all comers. So it's not illogical that Spain or that some of these regions like Italy and Germany and Austria and and Poland and even Russia will also start to get this nationalist identification. And once you've identified it, that we are the Spanish people, or we are the Italian people, or we are the German people, then the next stage of that is to put it into action. And that's a recognition that Napoleon and his troops are foreign occupiers of our soil, and we will fight them. And Spain basically introduces in this era guerrilla warfare. Do you guys know what that is? Okay, or asymmetrical warfare. But they're not going to be able to take on Napoleon's troops. The biggest, largest, most well-trained army that has ever existed in Western history at that time. But they can carry out little sabotage attacks against those occupying troops. And then just like Vietnam, what ends up happening? A guerrilla attack against French forces that are in Spain, stationed in Spain.
It's just not worth it anymore.
Well, but you got to get to that point. All right? But does this war begin and end like it did when he fought Austria? He would fight a war in 1800. By the end of 1800, there'd be a treaty. When he fought in Spain, he stayed in Spain. There was not going to be a treaty. There was a long, drawn-out conflict where France is starting to dump more and more resources into defeating or forcing the Spanish to capitulate, and they won't. All right? And then, like I said, if there's guerrilla attacks that are carried out against the French troops then will carry out a reprisal against the people that they think were responsible for it. And that's why you have, like there's a famous painting that I'm going to show you when we get to the age of Romanticism, but it's called The 3rd of May, 1808. And it's a Francisco Goya painting. And it basically has all of these Spanish civilians with their hands up, lined up against a concrete wall, because Napoleon's troops are going to mow them down. Because most likely they believed that they carried out some attack against the French troops, and this is how they were going to pay him back. And then once you see something like that, it's only going to encourage the resistance. Because those people are the enemy. They are evil. And they don't belong here and they need to go home. Okay? You want to create more Viet Cong? Kill a whole bunch of suspected Viet Cong in a public square and let all of the people see that you're murdering innocent civilians. Okay, and that's kind of what was happening in Spain. Now, every time Napoleon gets involved in one of these campaigns in the West and loses, and starts to lose his popularity, and you can imagine after 7 years, Napoleon needs a victory. Because he's bogged down in this war, they're losing resources, French troops are coming home in body bags, there's a whole bunch of people listening to Bob Dylan songs now, there's some hell no we won't go cheers in the streets of Paris. Napoleon needs to get the people back. And how does he know how to do it? Where does he often win?
Continental Wars.
All right, and this is the Hitler comparison, because remember, Hitler at one time in the early 1940s had control over all of continental Europe and was trying to take out Britain and was bombing them day after day after day, and they would not capitulate. And he had a peace treaty with Russia, or the Soviet Union, and decided, you know what, I'm going to disrupt that peace treaty and invade the Soviet Union. And Napoleon, after he realized he was never going to be able to defeat Britain and needed a victory, made a decision to invade Russia.
I found this one. And all
Okay.
troops froze to death.
Yep, because look at the line. If you look at the line here, and that's where Tilsit was, and that's where like they had ultimately created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. But now he makes this fateful decision in 1812 to carry out an invasion against Russia, and look at those supply lines. Okay? And that's what the Russians did. They're like, we're not idiots. We're not going to be able to defeat the French army. There's 600,000 of them. All right? So we'll let our elements defeat them. We'll let them extend their supply lines, or every time they come and think they're going to be able to engage the enemy won't be there. Because they've deserted the town. And so French troops are looking for a fight, and they're like, there's nobody here. And then they march another 30 miles, and they look for a fight. There's nobody there. Then they march another 30 miles. And eventually, by the time they get engaged, and it's in this battle called Borodino, where they did finally engage against the troops, they were exhausted. They were overextended. And now they're getting into the Russian winter, and now they're freezing. Okay? It's like a scorched, kind of scorched earth thing, where the Russians would burn their own town to the ground rather than turn it over to the French, to allow the French to be able to get into the town and then use it as a way to reconstitute themselves and resupply so that they could continue. It's pretty smart to just burn it to the ground. Now we can't use the resource.
It's very Russian.
Okay? But then, as they retreated, because they realized we're screwed, we have gone way too far now. We don't have an ability to continue to fight. We retreat. But by then, the Russians had started to go around the flanks and would hit them on the retreat. So by the end of it, 100,000 troops made it out of 600,000. Made it back after the retreat. And by then, everybody's got their nerve back. You know, the Austrians, the Prussians, anybody else that had, been basically forced into submission to Napoleon is now like, Napoleon's on the run. Let's get him. So the British come in, the Austrians come in. They're basically fighting with like 1/6 of their army now. It's in tatters. It's starving. It's freezing. And they're, able to finally take him out. It's called the Battle of the Nations, or the Battle of Leipzig. And then what takes place. Most of you are familiar with this after a while. Okay? He gets exiled. There's this little, tiny little place called Elba, which is a little island in the middle of the Mediterranean. But it's really, really close to France. Okay? But they exiled him to Elba. He broke out of Elba. For 100 days, he was able to gain control of his army. And then march them back. And then, even though they were negotiating, like the countries were negotiating, well, what's going to happen after the Napoleonic Wars? It's almost like they excused themselves from the peace table and said, oh, we just heard Napoleon's back out there again. So they had to get up and they had to go fight him again. And they ended up fighting him at Waterloo. Okay? And then Waterloo was the end. And then they're like, Elbow was close. This next exile is going to be not so close. And so they found like the smallest little island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that they could find. And they put him there. Made him like the Emperor of St. Helena. And then, British troops would like grab his hat. Like, come get it, Napoleon. So he's like, the end of his life, he got to write some memoirs, and that's nice and all.
They're French. Are they not comfortable just killing him? Just let's move on.
The British were not comfortable killing him, so they didn't. They just kind of let him. It was worse to take his army away and his fame and everything else, and let him know that he was going to have to live the rest of his life. It's like sometimes life in prison is better than the execution. But anyway, some of these names that you see, and this is another part of what I was talking about before. This is in that Kagan reading that you ought to finish. But it is one of the gifts that Napoleon gives the world, is that they are now kind of in touch with their history. They are in touch with what brings them together in their geographical space, or what they share with other people. And those are nationalists. Okay, there's going to be Italians and Russians and a ton of Germans. There is no push for united Germany if Napoleon doesn't push them in that direction. Okay, so you'll read about Karl von Hardenberg and you'll read about Goethe. Hardenberg is a politician that spends his time, eventually at Vienna. But Goethe and Jakob Fichte and Baron von Stein, and you'll read about later Johann Herder. These are people, and even Hegel, these are people that are fully aware of the idea of a German identity, and that so far it's been denied. Okay, and Spain, I mean, not only were they identified in the way that they were, but they're already evolved to the fact that they are a country and they're being occupied by somebody else. All right, but the 19th and 20th century gift that Napoleon gave, I told you, is the exportation of the French Revolution to every place else. Okay, liberty, fraternity, equality, Napoleonic code on the road, whatever you need to know. And even though he's defeated, okay, that happened, and it's going to be impossible for Europe to try to reckon with the fact that it didn't, or not reckon with the fact that it did. Like they want to go back, and that's what's going to be cool about it, is after Napoleon's defeated, there's a whole bunch of people that are going to spend the next couple of decades trying to imagine that the French Revolution and Napoleon didn't happen. But it did, and so it was like a fool's errand for them to pretend that it didn't. All right, and we'll talk about that after the break. Does anybody have any questions about any of that stuff? Okay, don't get so bogged down in the battles and the treaties and all of that stuff. But I mean, it really is a pretty simple explanation. All right, frustrations with Britain lead to attacks against the East, lead to successes in the East, lead to more frustrations with Britain, and then it just kind of cycles to a point where eventually it gets involved in Russia, and then it's over. Okay. And yeah, I mean, you got to look and say, like, after you defeated Gus Fring, could you have just walked away? Could you and Jesse have just taken, the money that you had made in the meth trade and just ended it there? And Napoleon at the end, at Tilsit, if somebody would have tackled him and said, dude, that was brilliant, let's go home. But I mean, he's famous no matter what, so maybe it all works out, but it could have worked out completely different. There was always this possibility, like when you do thought experiments, like what if Hitler were not anti-Semitic? Anybody ever think of that? Think about how much effort and how much energy and how much expense went into trying to create a policy to deal with his hatred of the Jews. Has anybody ever considered that? Like, think about who the physicists were that helped create the Manhattan Project. At least a number of those physicists were Jews in Europe that had fled because of Hitler's anti-Semitism. What if he had embraced them?
Probably be speaking German.
You know what I mean? But there's always something. And it's just like, look, for Napoleon, it could have just been a recognition that maybe Britain wasn't worth it. Maybe he could have even figured out a way to negotiate with them. But ultimately, that did him in. All right. That's enough for today. That is enough for